Scary paranormal stories. The Revenant of an Old Murder. Carlingford Road in North Dublin was a local ill fame when I was just a kid, being notable as the scene of a murder in the days when such a thing was still a rarity in these parts. The murder itself was, in fact, pre-war, and it says something about changes in society that such old crime remained remarkable even up to the 1980s. Not that I'm really a reactionary. Change is good and bad. As kids, we knew of the house where the murder occurred for an elaboration on the story. Of course, I'm not going to give the actual address, just in case someone will make me guilty of starting a nuisance. The narrative went like this. This house, the scene of the murder in the 1930s, was inhabited some 30 years later by a young family. The parents were going out one evening and left the children in the care of a cousin. Apparently, there was a history of trouble in the family. They were never comfortable in that house. I suspect that's what's been said so far, and is probably true enough. The children in bed, the cousin sat down to watch TV for the evening, expecting the parents to be back late. Versions of the story that were once done the rounds had it that this young man, the cousin, had been fooling around with a Ouija board, either in the house or sometime before. When darkness had fallen, he found his attention was constantly being taken by the sound of pebbles striking one of the windows. Of course, he suspected some local children to be the source. However, when he looked out the street, there was no one around. He checked on the kids upstairs several times, but they seemed to be sleeping. As this phenomenon kept reoccurring, he went out to the road in front, investigated all around the house, and even had the curtains held back while he was sitting there. Nothing appeared to be amiss. Eventually, he decided to just ignore the noises, continue watching TV. It could be birds or something. Then, all hell broke loose. The sound of strikes on the window quickly increased in intensity, so that he could not ignore it anymore. Upstairs, he heard the kids, who so far had been oblivious to the situation, suddenly break out crying. As he was running for the stairs to go calm them, he glanced up at the ceiling of the room where he had been sitting. He was struck down in terror. On the ceiling, as if painted there, was the hideous image of a child. Lifelike, though two-dimensional, was the form. But it was the face that frightened him the most. It was the face of a monkey. It was grinning at him with an expression of demonic glee. He fled the room and remained upstairs with the kids until the parents arrived home. This is the story we heard as children in the neighborhood. The Woman on the Stone. This is a personal account, though I can't deny that the whole subject of the supernatural has interested me since my early life. It has, nonetheless, been for more than 30 years that kept my peace about my one-lived encounter with that world. Why? For no reason to relate, or even to arrive at in my own head. I think it may have played on superstitious nature. Perhaps I feared that speaking about it might encourage it to occur again. It certainly was not pleasant. Whatever the explanation, it is only with the distance of many years that I feel comfortable enough to put into words what I saw. Though doubtless in description, it will appear less than the sum of its parts. The palpable dread of that memory, however, is beyond my skill to relate. I had a vision of something wretched, something foul. It took the form of a human, though it wasn't human, and possibly never was. It was in the summer of 1986, when I was 5. We lived at that time near the village of Swords in North County, Dublin, Ireland, at the edge of a housing estate called River Valley. Our house was the last house of the cul-de-sac that was set into a silent hillside, so that from the upper windows, we had a wide view of the land around us. At the time, the village and estate was still surrounded by fields, though it has since all been developed. The forest road that led up to the village was lined with great trees, beech, poplar, and pine. They looked like towers from my bedroom window, and a sheep field lay across the road from the side of the house. I have pleasant childhood memories of bright sunshine, warm breezes looking down on the lambs in the field from my side of the garden. My mother, with ghoulish humor, named one of the herd Mint Sauce. Visible also from my window, through the trees and undergrowth along the forest road, was an old, disused blacksmith's forge. I don't doubt that this too long has disappeared. Perhaps every childhood has its own haunted place. It was the local rumor that this old forge was badly haunted. A girl from my road, called Janet, used to offer up a dubious tale that some school friends, on a dare one evening, were driven, shrieking from one place, having heard a deep growl, while one of them was witnessing the phantom of a woman, or rather an invisible form of an old-fashioned print frock, hovering in the loft of an adjacent barn. So much for the local legend. I never went near the forge, and what I saw, I don't think has much to do with it. Then again, what do I really know? What I saw from the window of the spare room, just beside my own. At the front of the house, my grandmother used to sleep here when she would be over from her own house. This was in the city. It was the end of the summer, and my family had just returned from a holiday on the Isle of Man. It was a Thursday night, and on a childish flight of fancy, I crept from one bed into the spare room. I looked out on the darkened neighborhood. Shadows danced in the lighted porches of the house, and colored flashes came from the direction of Dublin Airport, across the fields. And then I looked down and saw it on the rock. There was a neighborhood marking stone at the entrance to the estate, just at the junction to the forest road, with the usual "Welcome to" inscription. It lay visible just below that spare room window. Sitting there was a diminutive figure of an old woman in an ancient dress. She wore a plaid cloak with an immense collar of shaggy fur, like the hair of a yak. Despite her apparent great age, her hair hung long and greasy black down from under her ragged cap. One deathly white hand was clasped over a large brooch on her cloak. The figure seemed to glow in its own light against the darkness. I saw nobody else about. Her face was abominable. She was shockingly pale, having heavy brow and terrible, raging eyes. They weren't the eyes of a human, more like a wild beast. More disturbing, however, was my realization that those eyes had been mixed in a stare up at me from where I had even raised my head over the windows. Whatever she was, she had been aware of me before I of her. It was a nightmarish sight, a vision of wickedness, but I was not sleeping. I remember the malevolence of the expression on that awful face. It induced a sickening feeling. I felt like vomiting, but I was unable to move. Then, the form of the little woman appeared to be growing steadily larger until she swelled well beyond the stature of a normal human being. She also appeared to rise in the air above her seat. Then, a trickle of crimson passed down over my eyes. The spell was broken. I collapsed down from the sill and hurried back to my own room. Later that night, I dared to glance out my window. But, of course, there was nothing to see. I never saw anything of that weird woman again, and I have been greatly glad of it. We moved house the year after, and that was that. But I've never talked about it or inquired further concerning all of this, all through these long years. Ghostly dreams. Hi. As long as I can remember, I've had demonic and paranormal dreams since I was 6. This won't be my last post about dreams. I'm used to scary things, and I actually have a pretty high tolerance to what actually scares me. But dreams are just dreams, right? Well, when I was 16, maybe 17, I had a brief experience after I woke up from the dream. This has never happened to me up until this point. I'll tell the dream in a present tense to best communicate the intensity that I felt. I don't know where I am. All I know is that I'm in some dark room with a dim spotlight, kind of like the beginning scenes of a horror video game. There's a wooden coffee table in front of me, and I'm sitting on a couch. Mom is next to me, and strangely giddy, while she holds some old 2000s video handheld recorder. "Watch this," she says as she excitedly shoves the recorder into my hands. There are a slew of random VHS type of videos on the screen. The videos just keep playing, one after another. These are videos of mostly children, possessed by demons. My visual perspective is now as if the tiny screen became a big movie screen. In one video, I don't know what this person looks like. They're wearing a head-to-toe hot pink bodysuit. It even covers their face. I'm assuming they're a child. They are sitting on a couch, table in front of them, and in the back, I can tell there is a kitchen. It is daytime. I see natural sunlight coming through a window, and the child is bouncing a ball on the table. Then they stop. But the ball is still bouncing at the same height and speed as if they were still using their hand. Next video. A baby sits on top of a play slide, some sort of thing in a daycare. The video zooms in, and the infant is disturbingly still quiet, except for slow breathing. It has all its teeth, but they're yellow. The saliva is gray, and the gums are all black. It has an abnormal smile, like the Joker's, and the breathing can be heard through its teeth. It also had no eyes. Literally 2 big black holes. Then all goes dark. I can't see in front of me, but then a pair of red, glowing eyes appears, then disappears. I wake up. I'm laying on my stomach, and I wake up somewhat sweating. My heart is pounding and racing. The amount of evil I felt was heavy, that I thought my heart would give out. I figured I would lay really still and repeat Jesus' name in my head until things felt better. I'm not sure which sensations came first, but I felt as if bugs tickled me everywhere. A cold spot came close to me, and then I smelt a vile odor that was like rotten eggs and burnt hair. Then it all went away. These things lasted about 30 seconds. Maybe these sensations were just tricks my brain was just playing on me, since I had just woken up from a very intense nightmare. I don't know. This dream stood out to me because children were involved, and it was something I've never seen nor experienced when I'm not sleeping. I'm curious what others' thoughts are about about this. Friends with a ghost. So, I was around 12, and I just started to go to secondary school here in the UK. My school was far away from where I lived, so I would get a coach each morning to do the hour drive up to my school. It would normally take me about 30 minutes or so to walk to the stop where they would pick me up at, and others waiting. One morning, the girl I usually walked with was ill, so I was doing the walk alone. I had my headphones in, as I always would, and was around the halfway to my walk when I felt a presence around me. I wasn't cold, but all the heat I had held disappeared in a second. Now, my family are very spiritual, and being an edgy 12-year-old, I always like to believe in the paranormal. So, with this old aura around me, I finished walking to my coach and got on when it arrived. Normally, when I was on the coach, I'd sit with the girl I'd walk with, but I had sat alone at the front of the coach that day. After about 10 minutes of driving, I felt a presence in the seat next to me. I couldn't see anyone there, but I could see an image of her in my head. She was a little girl, probably 6, maybe 7, light blonde hair, big blue eyes. I had never seen her or met her before, but she made me feel safe, and I didn't feel as lonely when she was there. I had never seen or met her before, just rode that 1-hour journey in silence. Then, when I got off the coach and went into the school building, the aura was gone. I didn't tell anybody about it. I didn't want my new friends thinking I was weird. But it stayed with me all day. Those meetings started to happen much more often, mostly when I was alone. She would sit with me in the house when I was all alone, and I started being able to know more about her. She never said anything, but I just started to know more and more. Her name was Vivian. She had been very poor when she was alive. She was in a wheelchair, which made sense because she only ever appeared in sitting positions. I had spoken to my grandmother about her. She said she must be my guardian angel, which at the time made me really grateful. Around 4 months after Vivian turned up, I went to visit my Nana. She did not live too far, so I made the walk up there to visit for the afternoon. It had been a while since we had seen each other, so she started to ask me about school, my family, and then she asked me if I had any new friends. I told her that I had met somebody at my new school, but I mentioned to her about the little spirit that speaks to me sometimes. She tilted her head and started asking me about her. I told her the only things I really knew. She was a little girl, pale with blonde hair and blue eyes. She was in a wheelchair, and she only ever showed herself when I was alone. My Nana leant back in her chair with wide eyes, but her expression soon softened. I asked what was wrong. She said that she had never told me this before, but she had lived in the house next door to mine when she was younger. And on top of that, in my house, there was a little girl who lived there named Vivian, who hardly ever came out. She was sick all the time. My Nana recounted that a few years before she moved, Vivian had died after contracting pneumonia. Her mother and brother moved away not long after. I sat there and just stared at her. My brain was failing to process what she had said, but I just nodded and had a sip of my drink, unable to think of something to say. And then my Nana said something that still warms me to this day. She probably shows up when you're lonely. She didn't have anybody to talk to when she was alone. I'm sure she sees you as her friend. After the visit, I never saw Vivian again, and sometimes I'd purposely stay home alone to see if she would show up. but she never did. I'm 20 now, and it's all so strange when I think back to it. I was a pretty lonely kid, so the fact a lonely spirit tethered itself to me so I could have a friend still makes me smile. Haunted by my unborn child. This is a true story, and is only a few instances of some of the scary things that have happened to us over the past 10 plus years. I apologize in advance for how long it is, but as I mentioned below, it really is a tiny percentage. But some of the scarier things that we have gone through and still go through on a daily basis. 4 months after I gave birth to my first child, my mom offered to sell me her in-home childcare business. She was ready to do something else after running her daycare for 20 plus years. I essentially grew up in the daycare and started working there in my teenage years. I helped run the business with my mother after graduating high school, so taking it over completely in my early 20s was an easy transition. My father had built a second house on their property, so she wasn't living in the house that the in-home daycare was run out of. It's more of a classification for the state licensing board. There's daycare centers, in-home childcare, etc. But that's not important. Fall of 2005, when my daughter was 5 months old, her dad and I thought it was best to buy my mom's daycare and move from the small 2-bedroom apartment we had been in, a not so great part of town, mind you, to the 5-bedroom house in the small town I grew up in, next door to my childhood home. Well, about 6 months after moving into our new home, we found out that we were expecting another, and I gave birth to my son in the winter of 2006. For a few years, things were relatively quiet. So let's fast forward a bit, all the way to 2009. My son is 3 and my daughter is 4.5. They were playing in the front part of our house that had been technically considered a daycare, and I had been sitting in the living room while they played. Out of nowhere, they both started simultaneously screaming and crying hysterically. They come running into the living room. After I get them calmed down, my daughter explained through tears that there was a little boy with glowing green eyes watching them play. She said he was peeking over the half of the wall that separates what was then the craft area from the kitchen. In my opinion, they were too young to make something like that up. They both told the same story for weeks after it happened, and for them to start crying at the exact same thing? The daycare had been closed for the evening. There was obviously nobody there when I went to look, so I 100% believe that they both saw something, and the events that followed confirmed that our house was, in fact, probably haunted. After that sighting, activity picked up, but was relatively innocent. Every day, as long as it was nice, my employees would all take kids out to playground, while I stayed inside to cook lunch. And quite a few times, I would see out of the corner of my eye this little boy running across the room. Out of habit, I'd remind him that we don't run inside, before realizing I was alone, and that all the children were outside and properly accounted for. Over time, things got worse. I had just gotten to bed one night, and I heard a strange noise over my son's baby monitor. I went in to check on him, and when I reached his door, I noticed a pillow over his face. I flipped the light on to see 2 small indentations in the pillow, and in that same split second, my son started gasping for air. There was some invisible thing trying to smother my baby with this pillow. After a few weeks of hell trying to get him to sleep in his own bed, things went back to normal for a while. I say normal, but at the very least, it wasn't actively trying to hurt my children. A few times a week, always at night, and usually between the hours of 10 p.m. and 3 a.m., we would hear faint chants, all the church songs coming over the baby monitors. I can't explain what it sounded like exactly, but it was by no means anything that would be sung or said in any modern church. The things would be getting knocked off shelves. I'd feel like what felt like something crawled into bed with me. I'd see things out of the corner of my eye, but more importantly, my kids weren't being affected. For a while, I was hopeful that the worst was over. About 4 months goes by, when, like before, just as I was getting into bed, I heard my daughter call out for me over the monitor. First in a quiet voice, she kind of whisper yells, "Mommy." But then a second later, she begins crying and said, "That wasn't nice." I run in there, and after I get her calmed down, she said there was somebody watching her. When she got scared, she called out for me. It made him mad, and he had scratched her. I pulled her sleep shirt to find 3 deep scrapes on her back that went from her left hip to her right shoulder, which would have been impossible for her to do herself unless she was secretly a contortionist at the ripe old age of 5. After that, I started calling anyone and everyone that I possibly could and try to find help online. Or, at the very least, get some answers as to what we might be dealing with. After a week or so of emails and phone calls, I get a phone call from a well-known medium in my state. He asks a handful of questions just about the general activity in my house, but nothing about my job, marital status, nothing that could have led him the answer that he gave me. I was literally in the middle of answering a random question when he interrupts and says that the spirit in my house was my child. He somehow knew that I had previously had a miscarriage, and he explained that my son was jealous of the attention his brother and sister were getting, and he was angry with them for getting to have a life with me that he would never get. He told me what I needed to do to stop it all, to get rid of the spirit in my home, but I can never do it. If this medium is believed to do what he says, I would be casting out my own child. Obviously, I had to put my living children first. Their safety was and always will be my top priority. But after acknowledging what was in my house and walking around probably looking like a crazy person talking to him whenever I was alone, everything got better. The kids would see him once in a while, well up until they both reached around the age of 7 and 8. For the most part, he left them alone. They both over time have forgotten most of it and what they went through when they were young. My son, who is now 13, will still see things. In fact, not long ago, he came running into the living room. He said he thought he saw the shadow of a person. He didn't know why, but he felt like he was being chased. So, other than small things like them hearing what sounds like somebody walking up and down the stairs, things being pushed off the shelves, or doors being opened, the activity in my house, as far as my kids are concerned, has pretty much stopped. This story may be long, and I'm sorry for that, but it really is the bare bones of what we went through, and what we are still going through today. I can't explain why, but I honestly felt like it would all get 100 times worse if I had tried to get rid of him completely. And yes, 10 plus years later, he is still here. At least a few times a month, I will hear what sounds like my living son's voice outside my bedroom door at night saying, "Mom." He would do that a lot when he was little and got scared. Instead of coming in my room, he would just stand in my doorway calling out for me. The strange part is that voice I hear is not the crackly voice he has now as a 13-year-old pre-pubescent teenager. It's the sweet, innocent voice he had as a small little boy. Many people have told me that this is not just the jealous spirit of my unborn child, that it is some sort of poltergeist, and that regular spirits cannot do what we have seen him do. But for whatever reason, the way we have chosen to approach the situation has somehow made coexisting possible. And for me, that's more than enough. I just don't have to make it in me to make it leave. I don't think I ever will. He's coming. A few years back, I worked at clubs. Basically, the asking for tall, buff, shirtless bartenders on weekends is pretty sweet, and the pay and tips is great. Even better if you bounce your pecs for some gay guys and drag queens while having a good time. So usually, I would leave home at 8 p.m., work from 8:30 to 3 to 5 a.m., depending on the day and the amount of guests. This one time, in what I remember as early November, I took the bus home right around 3 a.m. and sat on it, playing on my phone like always. When it was time to get off, I plugged my headphones in, clicking the play button. This button usually restarted my playlist, but in this very, very rare case, my music app was out as a whole, and the closest radio station cut in. The reception by the sea was pretty poor for some reason, and the music cut in and out, but so did somebody speaking. It went something like this. Coming, coming, behind, coming, run, run, move, coming now. Mixed with a song and somebody speaking. I could not make out what that was, but I decided to take the detour, avoiding the main road since there's no people around me. I walk on the other side of small houses from the road that I'd be on, otherwise, and see a white van slowly driving up and down the street repeatedly. It was pretty odd. I didn't pay it much mind until I get to the end of the street that I'm on, and I see it drive ahead of me where I'm going. I take a shortcut through the backyard of a couple of homes. Didn't step on the flowers, of course, and went on emerging from the opposite side of where I'd come from if I took the normal way. That same van is parked right outside my stairwell, and there is a guy poorly hidden in the driver's seat. He's peeking up just enough to make me see his eyes, and he's thinking I haven't seen him. I pick up my phone, start the flashlight, and film the car while walking up to it, putting in the PIN code and going upstairs. The guy was so taken by me making it clear I saw him that he didn't even bother. He cowered in the front seat. I had more run-ins with stalkers when working there over the years. I know the radio was most like a coincidence, but if it wasn't for that very strange transmission, I had never taken the detour, and just maybe, I wouldn't have made it home. Also, sometimes my workplace friends in there told me that they were followed home by guests there, all bartenders who were fit, but also all straight. We more than often took straight girls home who went there with friends, leaving some people jealous. My elementary school experiences. Before I get to this event, let me tell you first about my elementary school. Rather, what was said to me before our directress bought it. It is imperative as you understand the school building's layout and story that might make this hopefully easy to visualize and understand. It was said to be an old ancestral home, and they demolished most of it, leaving the wooden staircase stretching from the first to third landing. That staircase is located at the south of our school, near Cassie Pagan Street. That's the only place in our school that wasn't modernized, and the second that spot that I know of where crazy things can happen. That also the second least human active spot. A lot of experiences happened around my school, 3 of which happened during the stretch that I and my 2 brothers schooling there. Yes, all 3 of us. But I'll talk about my latter 2. Anyway, to my memory, that staircase is always locked. But with me and my laziness and mischievousness, I always try to unlock it in the 6th grade for 2 reasons. Number 1, as the first landing in the middle of our cafeteria, I'm the slowest eater out of all the batch, being super talkative. And 2, the 3rd landing is open and leads directly to our 6th grade classrooms. Now, the scary part is the 2nd landing. For some weird reason, that part is the most uncomfortable area of my school. That part was the only place in my school that had really difficulty in trying to make use of. Every time I pass through that landing, I feel scared and nervous. Maybe it's because I know of what I've seen that day, or my knowledge of its presence gave me that impression. I don't know, but remembering how that began is both funny and freaky at times. As the weirdest girl in the batch, I was bullied by the popular kids in school. Ostracized by the majority is the result of that, but I do my best not to mind. Still seeing the popular boys rushing into our classroom, with some sweating and having tears in their eyes, screaming, "Molto, molto, me molto. Ghost, ghost, there's a ghost." Their scared look made me smile and laugh in vindication after all the pain they socially and psychologically put me through. Still, the best part of me won out in the end, and I began to ask around. As they are popular males of the batch, their business is everybody's peace, and it was easy to draw out the W's. Apparently, they were hanging out in the comfort room. The male comfort room is next to the Sci Lab. Yes, the science lab is built around the 2nd landing of that beautiful wooden staircase. Suddenly, in the darkness, the boys saw a lady in white, crouched to the teacher's desk, sink with their face to her hands. They felt terror as they looked on and ran off, as this was truly the first time a horror apparition happened in front of students. Naturally, an uproar ensued, and kids trying to look for the apparition. Some got to see it, others did not. Those that did see the apparition, along with the boys, said the same thing. Some who saw it after, and the boys saw the lady in different positions, standing in the corner, sitting. But it always seemed the lady never bothered to look outside the lab. No one saw the lady facing them. I remembered myself finding it odd as being in front of the sci-fi lab gate in St. Therese, our patron saint whom the school is named after, as we are under the protection of a saint. Why would there be a ghost? Still, curiosity grew and I went to see it. Sadly, my batchmates' rambunctious behavior and curiosity regarding the entity caught the teacher's attention, forcing the class to stay indoors as the recess time ended. Still, I went to see it. As class began, I excused myself by saying I want to go out to the comfort room. I glanced at the science lab, but no lady. I shrugged and did my business. I went out again and glanced at the lab. No lady. A batchmate of mine saw me and understood what I was trying to do and said to stay and look at the lab for 5 seconds. I thanked him and he went into the comfort room. I counted slowly. 1, 2, 3. Before I could form the word 4, I saw her. What was different was the lady was positioned 45 degrees behind the saint and was looking directly at me. I froze, rooted to the ground. And frankly, I don't feel that scared. Just confused about one thing. Why does she have no face? And then I realized, why did I not feel scared? I don't know how long I was standing there, but when that question popped into my head, I felt like wanting to get out of there. So I ran back to the classroom, still weirded out and struck with questions. Why am I the only one she faced? Why doesn't she have a face? I went home, told my mother almost everything. I didn't expound on my happy emotions of seeing the boys scared out of their wits. But I focused on one thing. Why doesn't she have a face? Mom said that something might have happened to her, and she's asking for prayers. At that time, I took her explanation as to the truth. She has seen her fair share of ghosts. She also has experienced a ghost sighting in my same school, and told me what the building was before we immigrated here. After that incident, around 2 months later, the science lab was relocated and the landing was now turned, questioningly, into the teacher's lounge. Strange choice, as just a month ago, we saw a ghost. Unexpectedly, the arrangement didn't stay long. Before the school year was out, the teacher's lounge was moved to somewhere else, with some teachers complaining about strange things I can now barely remember. I forgot what they did to the second landing. I remember not caring and always rushing to reach the third landing every time. I used it as a shortcut in 6th grade. Before graduation, they changed the locks in the first landing, so I was never able to use that staircase again. Still, I wonder what I have seen. I rarely remember the lady nowadays. Every time I visited my school during my high school years, I was always distracted, as it's a private school. I can only go in if there's an event that my brothers are involved in. I rarely visit that end of the school anyway. I tried once but chickened out. Ironically, I chickened out when I'm near the 2nd floor comfort room. Typing the incident, or reliving the memory of it, still gives me shivers that I felt that day. I still want to understand what it is that I've seen. Now, this part is now about what my mom told me that happened a couple of years before the science lab debacle. So, you see, a year or two before all that, the school decided to install CCTV cameras around the school, around main stairs and corridors. These would all be connected to the main TV in the waiting area, where parents and the security guards can see into, and the principal's office. I saw this as the principal's office is connected to once to the nurse's office. I snooped around when I got sore eyes. This was also the reason why I got caught pressing the fire alarm in 4th grade. Shameless, but it's memory, so I don't care anymore. And thanks to that memory, I sure as heck remember thinking how I would have gotten away with it if I did it for the other year. Anyway, if going through that logic, this must have happened in 3rd grade. I'm certain as by then, my brother would have been in grade 2, and the school I've just relocated to the location it is now, near Copylandia and ASDM. Their classroom is situated on the 1st floor together with 1st grade classrooms. At that time, my brother's dismissal time was around 7. The last class as the other grade ends, as their classes at 5 p.m. That was the latest they can go. According to my mother, at the time, it was noisy like always. Filipinos loved to chatter. That was the norm. My mom has introverted tendencies, so she rarely bothered but just stared at the gate where my brother and his classmates are supposed to go out. What was different on that day was that once a noisy clamor was suddenly silent. Everyone suddenly stared at the TV. The normally vacated at the time 3rd floor suddenly has a person in the halls. Except this person. The same person was gliding through the corridor to the direction of the comfort rooms, and that old staircase, which I later pointed out to Mom. It was so inhumanly fast and out of place that, when an angel, that's what we call the staff that helps out with the school maintenance, went out. She was hounded with questions about the possibility of somebody still on the 3rd floor, which she answers impossible. Everybody works on schedule, and their schedule dictates that nobody should be working or staying on the 3rd floor right now. Everybody should only be on the 1st floor at that hour. That's what Mom remembers she explained. If that's the case, who's the anomaly gliding on the 3rd floor? My guess is the lady, but she ain't the only one in school. I know as much when I graduated there. What are your thoughts? The encounter. This story takes place on a lake in central New Hampshire, just a few miles north of the base of Mount Kearsarge. My friend has a cabin there that his grandfather built shortly after returning from the Second World War. And on one warm summer night, between my junior and senior years of high school, he and I were there, just hanging out. While we did drink and partake in the ganja from time to time, we weren't intoxicated in any way on this specific night. We'd simply been bored in our little hometown, about 30 miles or approximately 48 kilometers to the south. So, on a whim, one evening, we decided to drive up and spend the night there to light a fire, sit by the water in beach chairs, and enjoy the nighttime t-shirt and swimming trunks weather while it lasted. I'd say it was about 9 or 10 p.m., and we had gotten up to inspect his granddad's old canoe that laid upside down atop the wooden dock. We wanted to use it the next day to head to the lone island. This way, we could look for loon nests and try to catch some hornpout. As we walked to the dock from where we had been sitting, I gazed across the lake at Mount Kearsarge. The mountain has a height of roughly 3,000 feet, or 895 meters, a prominence of 2,080 feet, or 630 meters. So, it was basically 2,000 feet straight up from our position, as we're only a couple of miles from its summit. It was quite an imposing figure in the night sky. Now, the mountain has a tower on the peak that flashes a red light at night. There is only one red light, and it is red. I had seen it so many times before. It was just a fact. However, as I followed my friend to the dock, I noticed there were 2 lights on this night, in addition to the usual red flashing light. There was a second yellow-orangish orb to its right, essentially about the same height. It wasn't moving, flashing, pulsating, nothing. It just hung there, motionless in the night sky. I told my friend, who was immediately interested, and so we both stood transfixed for a while before he asked me what I thought it was. I would have immediately considered helicopter, but it was so still and silent. After a few moments of silent staring, we both shrugged our shoulders, continuing on down to the canoe at the end of the dock. We inspected it for a while, placing it in the lake for check for leaks, deciding that it was definitely good to go for tomorrow, which was exciting. We were really looking forward to getting in the water. After looking it back to its original resting position, I turned to my right, bent down to wash the cobwebs off my fingers in the lake water. As I'm doing this, I returned my gaze to the mountain, and to my amazement, there were now 2 identical orbs, one on either side of the red, flashing light. I smacked my friend across the shoulder, told him to look up, and again, we just stared, transfixed. Although, this time, a little more anxiety-ridden. "What is that?" my friend said, with a bit of fear creeping into his voice. Without averting our gaze, we backpedaled to our chairs and began discussing possibilities. It is important to note that both of us were science-believing realists, and still are to this day. We also both accepted the distinct possibility that we humanly are most likely not alone, let alone the universe. Something, all the grains of sand on the earth, you know, the old Carl Sagan wordage. So we sat there discussing both the different paradoxes and the likelihood that it was just something visiting us. Perhaps something that was also temporary, human-made, that would sit on top of the mountain. Something had happened. Before our eyes, one of these orbs descended below the backside of the mountain and out of sight entirely in that amount of time. It was impossible for any helicopter or known human craft to do something like this. I'm sorry. I know I'm not no engineer or anything, but I know what a helicopter looks like when it descends in elevation. This was not like that at all. It sunk down and out of sight in less than 2 seconds, all without making any lateral movement whatsoever. We were stunned, but before we had time to wallow in this feeling or think about what could possibly be going on, the other orb took off from its position. It didn't gain or lose any elevation. It just took off horizontally at breakneck speed and began to make its way around the edge of the lake. It wasn't until the light was about halfway between its starting point and our position that we began to consider that it might be heading straight for us. We stood still at the shore, followed the object with our eyes. Out of sheer curiosity, and without speaking, we'd both made the unconscious decision to wait and see what would happen. I mean, what else were we supposed to do? At no point did we talk or look at each other. We just stood there, watching. Without leaving you in suspense for too long, the object did eventually arrive at where we were. And upon its arrival, it slowed to a crawl and creeped over us at a snail's pace. It was big. Not stereotypically a mothership, but big. I don't know exactly if I had to estimate, but I would say it was maybe 50 meters in length by 30 meters in width. It was shaped like a fat cigar and had 2 or 3 rows of orange lights on its bottom. I couldn't tell you what my friend was doing or how he was reacting, for I was entranced. I remember thinking that I had never, ever had an opportunity to view something like this, nor would I again. This was a once-in-a-lifetime experience, so I stared intensely, examining anything and everything I could about it. Unfortunately, there were no other details I could make out, only its approximate dimensions and the rows of lights. It made no sounds aside for what I perceived to be a very, very faint humming. There were no beams of light shooting down at us or anything, and we stood in the pitch blackness of the late New Hampshire night. I remember prepping myself for something to happen. Nothing did, and as soon as it creeped its way past, it took off as fast as it appeared, up in the night of the sky and out of sight. At that point, I shot my head back across the lake and towards the mountain. There was nothing but the normal, flashing red light remaining. All appeared to be back to normal for now. I don't think we said anything to each other aside from "let's get out of here," or something to that effect, before grabbing what little we had brought with us and hightailing it back to my friend's car. We drove the 30 miles back to our hometown, purchasing some snacks at the convenience store, returning to his house, where we proceeded to set up the same beach chairs that we had brought with us to the lake, in his backyard, where we stayed up for most of the night, to talk about what we had just seen. For the next few weeks, my mind could hardly focus on anything. I even told my parents at some point, but they sort of laughed it off, telling me I probably saw a helicopter or something. And after their reaction, I decided not to tell anybody else about the experience for years. Not until I was older, and gave no craps about what people would think. Also, did I begin to tell trusted friends about what had happened that night. My friend and I have since parted ways. We live across an ocean from each other now, and talk from time to time. In fact, I think it's been a few years since one of us has even brought it up. However, sitting here and running it down, going down the log of events, just as now made me want to reach out and talk with him again about it. I know what I saw. This thing was not constructed by humanity. We don't possess that sort of technology. And if we do, then there is far more hidden from the average citizen of Earth than I ever thought possible. But I'm digressing into conspiracy theories, and that is a path I try not to go down. The fact is that the possibility that we are not alone in the universe is so microscopically small. Consider this. There are billions of planets out there that are much, much older than Earth. All it would take is one of them to have a developed intelligent life a few million years ahead of us, giving them a massive head start in development of technology. That would allow them to create machines that are capable of doing what the objects I saw that night did. Ghost. So, I'm a very light sleeper. I wake up at the drop of a pin. Literally. Last night, I had a nightmare that my oldest son, of just 4 years old, was screaming and crying. His eyes were closed, and he was in his bed. I woke and just lay there, staring at the ceiling, wondering if it was a dream or if I really heard him crying. I heard a noise from the kitchen and saw a small light turn on. I thought to myself, oh great, one of them are up. So I get out of bed and looked out at the kitchen. Their door and gate was closed, and one of the boys' tablet screen had lit up. Side note, I always plug their tablets at night and put them on the counter, standing up so they don't overheat. Their tablets have never just turned on before. We also don't keep any light plugs and lights on in our living room, since it is pitch black. I was confused, but went and locked the tablet screens, went to the restroom, and then back to bed. Keep in mind, I didn't turn on any lights doing all of this. I was in bed for about 3 minutes with my eyes closed, before I felt the urge to open them. The tablet screen was on again. I got up and looked out the doorway, more confused than ever, but went and locked the screen again. I hadn't even been back in bed a whole 30 seconds, and it turns on again. At this point, it was 3:20 a.m. My husband's alarm was set to go off at 3:30 a.m. for work. I elbowed him, told him what was happening. His response, "What?" Probably thinking I was half awake and dreaming. Then the tablet light went off again. I elbowed him a second time. "Did you see the light go off?" He whispered, "Yeah." We lay there for a few more moments, but felt like hours. I told him to get up and get the gun and make sure nobody was out there. He thought I was crazy, but I pointed out that I did not turn on any lights, so I didn't ever see if anybody else was out there. The tablets never do this. He got his gun and turned on all the lights, and no one was in here. I told him to just go turn on both of them, like power them off. He went to do it and heard the Amazon fire noise of each of them being turned off. Then he came back to our room and said, "Hey, I don't want to freak you out, but it was, child's name, tablet turning on and off." I told him to go check on them, and they were fine. My son, who I had the dream about, ended up coming to bed. He woke up and didn't feel comfortable with him not being right beside me. What a night. My ghost encounters in Jackson County, Mississippi. Let me start off by saying I've never had any mental problems that would cause me to hallucinate or see and hear things that aren't there. I've also been very sensitive to energies and things of the unknown and supernatural. So, here are just 2 of my encounters that happened a couple of weeks apart. I'll go ahead and set the scene for you. I was born and raised here in Mississippi. I'm a 33-year-old female. We've had all kinds of strange supernatural incidents. The Phantom Barber, the 1975 alien abduction, the haunted Longfellow House, the legend of the Singing River. Do yourself a favor and look that one up. There was even a little-known murder of a local teacher on her lunch break by a man committing a ritualistic satanic sacrifice. But I digress. At any rate, I still live here. I reside in Jackson County, the farthest south in the state you can possibly go. When someone thinks of Mississippi, the first thing people think is backwoods and hicks. This is not anything like that. A whole lot of suburbs. In fact, we are home to the largest employer in the state. Anything south of Interstate 10 is full-on city. But the first incident took place in Helena. It's about 10 minutes from here, and is sort of in the middle of nowhere. Specifically, where I was. It was 5 minutes north of Interstate 10. I was in a small trailer park accommodating 5 small trailers, far back off the road. If you were standing on the street, it looked like the driveway just went on into the woods indefinitely. When I first moved there with my friends and roommate Stacy, an older male friend, being in the trailer gave me the creeps. It always felt like somebody was watching me. Nothing serious, just a slight unease. Well, after about 8 months living there, my friend and her daughter came to stay with us while they looked for a place to live. The daughter was mixed and her mom was full white. This will be important later. Not long after they moved in, the activity picked up exponentially. Stacy never believed it, but her daughter, who I was close with, we'll call her P, and I would see things. At first, I thought I might be imagining things. That was until we saw the same stuff at the same time. At first, I was seeing an older and younger African American man for just a nanosecond. Then they were gone. Then, it started with the bathroom sink. I would hear it turn on and off again. I thought I was hearing, until one time I heard it. Ran into the bathroom. It was still on. I was home alone. Now, to have set up the next part, I have to tell you how the house is set up. At one end of it was the kitchen, then the living room. Then from there, the hallway starts. My room was first, then the bathroom, then lastly was Stacy's room. P was in the kitchen and I in my room. I heard the bathroom sink turn on. Confused, I stuck my head put while calling for P. But as soon as I did, it turned off, and P walked to the hallway from the kitchen and said, "Yeah?" She was basically behind me, trying to make sense of this, and I asked, "Were you just in the bathroom?" Her eyes got big, and she spoke nervously. "No, I thought that was you." Now, P is not easily scared. I've known her to be scared of anything, but at that moment, I could tell she was. A few days later, I had P take me in my car, since I was too tired to drive and it was now about 10 p.m., to go to Walmart. My car was parked to the right of Stacy's. When we went to pull out, we would make a 3-point turn. Because of this, the driver's side windows would be facing the back of his truck. Well, as we were about to put the gear into drive from reverse, I reached to grab my purse from the floorboard of the driver's seat and just so happened to look up. That's when I saw it. Next to Stacy's tailgate. It looked like a man sitting. A white man in a black hooded robe with a skull painted on his face. Let me remind you, we're here in the middle of nowhere, in the woods. I didn't say a word. I just ducked down, now staring at the inside of the driver's door. P began to ask what was wrong. I said, "What are you doing? Oh my, look at the windows down." She throws it in drive. We must have slung rocks all the way to the road. Now, my theory is that I know I'm sensitive, but from what I can tell, so is P. I also feel like somebody who owned the land in the past may have sacrificed slaves, possibly children in some bizarre satanic ritual. When P moved, it triggered something. I later told an old neighbor about the story. She turned pale and her jaw hit the floor. Stumbling over her words, she told me about how her young children used to ask her if they could go play with the kids outside. There were no other kids around. Here's the second story. About 2 weeks later, I had P take me, again at nighttime, to the St. Andrews area of Ocean Springs, Mississippi. It's only 2 towns over from here. St. Andrews is vastly undeveloped, with trees virtually everywhere. The place I was going was on a road that had trees on one side, maybe one house on the other. Let's just say it's mostly woods. When we pulled up, she just pulled into the yard. I went inside to take my friend and borrow some money from him. When I came back out, the car was now parked parallel to the curb. I can now see the majority of the car still from the porch, aside from the back windshield, as it was obstructed by a tree that was in my line of sight. I could see the front part and the trunk. And I saw a figure standing by the driver's door, which at first I assumed to be P. Once my eyes adjusted, I could see it was an old white man. Red short-sleeved button-up and navy blue slacks. His gray and white hair was slicked back. He had his hand placed on the driver's door, like he was trying to get in. Once I realized it wasn't P, I yelled, "Hey, what are you doing?" He turned to look at me, then started towards the back of the car. But once he began walking behind the tree, he disappeared. Stunned, but worried about my friend, I sprinted to the car. As I made it to the car, she unlocked the door, while simultaneously jumping into the passenger seat. P was frantic, no color on her face. I asked what had happened. She managed to get this out. "He was trying to get the door open." I asked where he came from, and without missing a beat, she replied, "The woods. Where'd he go?" I told her he disappeared behind the tree, and all she could manage to articulate was, "Why does this keep happening to us?" It's been a few years now, and P and I don't really talk anymore. I think since we're both sensitive, together, we've attracted paranormal going-ons. It's probably safer for both of us that we don't really hang out anymore. Premonition. Hey guys. So, I'm not a writer, so deal with it. This story happened to me 7 years ago. I was 21 years old at the time, and to this day, I still don't know what I saw. My last class of the day was around 8 to 9 p.m. I was tired, but still joking with my friends about how a 1-hour class turned into a 3.5-hour speech about STDs. Suddenly, I felt my chest hurt, like it's never before, and I felt really sad out of nowhere. Like I had a really, really bad feeling. Impending doom. So, I get into my car, speed off to home. Physically, I was okay, but this devastating feeling was not going away. On my usual way home, I always drive under a poorly illuminated short bridge. When I passed it completely, I see this dark creature sitting on the hood of my car, watching me. It was like a gargoyle, the size of a teen or so, completely dark, almost black, with unspread wings. It wasn't moving at all. It just kept watching me. So I kept driving, telling myself that it was just my mind. "You're scared, that's all." I kept repeating to myself like my own mantra. The thing is, what I was seeing, this creature didn't scare me. I was so starstruck that it calmed me down somehow. But I knew something awful was about to happen. This visualization was like a confirmation. I don't know how, but it was like the gargoyle was telling me his eyes, "I'm sorry it has to be this way." When I finally got home, it was dark. No lights were on outside, which was weird. They were always left on at night. Always. Then, I realized something. My brother was looking through the blinds and opened the door for me. His face was blank of expression. I asked where our parents were, and he said, "Yeah, Grandma called 30 minutes ago. Grandfather fell from the roof of the house. They went there to help." Just like that, the pressure lifted off my chest, everything clicking into place. Doomsday became real. because sadly, he died that night of October due to severe brain trauma. Earlier that year around May, he was repairing the rooftop of his house when he suddenly had a heart attack. He went into immediate emergency surgery, and everything went okay, as it be. The cardiologist told him to wait a month before returning to regular activities, so he told Grandma that the roof had to wait a bit, but he would finish it. Later on in June, one night, he kept hearing his dogs barking, so upon going outside to check on them, on the front fence, he saw this homeless guy who was asking for money to get something to eat. My grandpa told him to wait. He would just get him a plate of food. So when he was turning around to go back to the house, the guy grabbed a sawed-off shotgun from his bike and shot him. Then the man ran off. Nothing was missing. My grandpa went into surgery, lost a lot of blood. He even needed transfusions, and the surgeon had to remove a foot of intestine due to the injuries. When we went to see him in the hospital, he was somehow cheerful, said he wasn't in any pain. Then he mentioned that he knew that he had protection, because it was like he had a shield that covered him. He knew he was not going to die that night, even when he was lying on the floor, dragging himself and yelling to my grandmother to call 911. Also, during our visit, he said to my grandmother, "Don't worry, I'm not going anywhere until I finish the roof and leave you with no problems." The day my grandfather died, he was just finishing the roof. The Banshee. I grew up on a farm just outside of Limerick in Ireland, which, as you can imagine, made for quite an eventful upbringing. It also meant my back garden was bloody massive, so I had plenty of space to run around outside, playing make-believe with my two sisters. Without a shadow of a doubt, our favorite toy was the little windy house that Dad had built for us that sat just at the end of the garden. I don't know if they have those in the rest of the world, but basically, a windy house is like a little miniature playhouse, just for kids. I say little, but Dad had built us a massive one, with like a little hallway and a kitchenette, and a little ladder going upstairs to a play loft. It was absolutely adorable. Me and my sisters loved it. So much so that one summer's night, when it was warm enough, we asked Mom and Dad if we could sleep out in the windy house one night. They were understandably reluctant to give us permission at first, but upon pestering them, they finally relented. We could have a sleepover in the windy house, but we had to be on our best behavior, not fight, and promise not to go walking around in the dark. It was a deal. You can understand our parents' reservations too, because the end of the garden I mentioned was probably roughly 100 meters away from the actual house, near this old shuck that backed out onto some woodland. Not the ideal place to leave your kids alone overnight. So, that's how 3 girls under 10 years old ended up in a dimly lit, wooded playhouse, in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night. For some reason, my older sister Kathleen decides it would be a great idea to tell some ghost stories. Kathleen has always been a bit strange. She's always had this fascination with ghosts and ghoulies and witches and whatnot, ever since she was little. And since she had gotten her hands on a book of Irish ghost stories, she thought she might regurgitate one of these stories that she's read to us. She began telling us about a ghost that actually originated here in Ireland. That, unlike Dracula or Frankenstein, which comes from other countries, as 9-year-old her put it, we actually had banshees in Ireland, since that is where they originated from. Our minds are absolutely blown. Ghosts live in graveyards, old houses, and other haunted places. You had to go to the haunted place to see one. But here's Kathleen, telling us about how a ghost that actually comes to you. to tell you that someone's going to die in your family. And the way it lets you know this is by screaming in the middle of the night, like a ghostly, ear-piercing wail. Kathleen goes on to tell us that these banshees are women who have died in terrible, horrific, painful ways, hence the screaming. And they looked like shriveled old women with red eyes, who carry bowls of blood. We were just about trembling in our pajamas by the time Kathleen finished describing this nightmarish appearance of the banshee by torchlight. Somehow, when Dad came to interrupt and tell us it was bedtime, we still managed to get comfy and drift off to a rather uneasy sleep. The next thing I know, I'm now awake in total darkness. Everything is deathly quiet. Then, I hear something that was so frightening that at first, I think I just froze up in complete terror. It was this shrill, ear-piercing shriek, almost gravelly too, as if it had come from the throat of an old woman. When I finally found the courage to move, I shut up from my makeshift bed, shaking my sisters awake, telling them to listen. We sat there in the darkness for a moment, all three of us terrified. Then, we heard the screech again. That's when we decided to listen closer. We just sat there in the darkness for a moment. Shh. All three of us, scared out of our mind. We heard it for a second time, and just about my mind was so filled with fear. My little sister, she took it even worse. She screamed it's a banshee, and I remember her crying, "We have to tell Mom and Dad." Then my big sister, God bless her, decides that even though she's terrified, she's going to go run to Mom and Dad so they can rescue us from the banshee. I mean, what else could we have done? What else could have been making these ungodly noises? We're frantically looking for our torches, but in our panic, we can't find them. When the banshee screams for a third time, Kathleen decides she can't afford to wait another second. She gets up in complete darkness, climbs down the little ladder, and opens the Windy House door. She runs off and fetches rescue. While Kathleen was gone, me and my little sister managed to find one of the torches. We flick it on and point it down at the Windy House door from the loft. You know, I don't know what the logic of that was, but that's what we did. We cuddled together, we cried, and we waited for the banshee to come get us. After a minute or so, we hear rustling outside the Windy House. Something was moving just outside. We're so scared of the thing that's hearing us. We've got our hands over our mouths, but we still can't stop crying, and we still don't turn the torches off. Suddenly, the door opens, and what stepped inside made me and my little sister scream in pure horror. Blood was pouring down the mouth and chin of my big sister, and now she's back in the light. Now she too can see that she's bleeding. She smears a bit of blood on her fingers, looks at it, then promptly collapses. We are absolutely inconsolable at this point. So, me and my little sister are begging, screaming, crying for our parents to come and save us. To us, Kathleen just ran up to get help, and the bloody banshee's only gone and gotten her before she could make it. We're trapped, and this banshee is now getting closer. We're doomed. Then, there's more footsteps outside the Windy House. Heavier footsteps now. Banshee footsteps. The door swings open again. Only this time, the face of our dad appears, wanting to know what is going on out here. And we're screaming, "Dad, there's a banshee, be careful. It got Kathleen. Behind you." He's obviously skeptical as anything at first, but he sees Kathleen's face. Now it is his turn to be terrified. He turns ashen and grabs Kathleen's little body up in his arms, rushes back to the house with her. So keep in mind that even at this, the point of parental intervention, Dad has not taken the time to tell us that there definitely is not a banshee. And if anything, his reaction at Kathleen's face confirmed that not only is there definitely a banshee outside, but he's completely abandoned us. Seriously, just try and imagine being 7 and that being your truth. We didn't calm down for hours. Mom and Dad say we were still up crying at 1 o'clock in the morning, with the whole incident going on at about 10. Even when we knew everything was okay, we just cried because it'd been so traumatic. Obviously, there was no banshee. We didn't find this out till years later, for obvious reasons. But what we had heard as the sound of 2 foxes making love. As me and my sisters know too well, when they do that, the lady fox screeches, producing what is a rather unsettling, unworldly sound. Kathleen, being the big, brave sister she was, had ran out to protect us. But maybe if she was as nimble as she was courageous, she would not have run directly into that tree in her blind panic, almost knocking herself out in the process. Best she could do was retrace her poor, befuzzled steps back to the Windy house and pass out at the sight of her own blood. It's a story we tell every Christmas now, especially whenever there's a new boyfriend or husband making an appearance. It always gets a laugh or two. But I think if you put a gun to my head and asked me for the scariest moment of my life, I'd say the banshee when I was 7. I'm deadly serious. Scarier than childbirth. Scarier than finding the lump in my breast. Scarier than confronting my first husband about his drinking. Because I believed in something I didn't understand. Something supposedly mythical. Something that even my dad was scared of. Needless to say, there were no more sleepovers in the Windy house that summer. And the whole thing went arseways and fell down a few years later. But me and my sister will always have a story to share. We were scared for our lives. Something in the dark. I'm not sure if this is the type of story, what you're looking for, but it was creepy and alarming, enough to stick with me. This was over a year or 2 ago. I'm a young 20-something living in Southern California, in the San Diego area. I live with my family, including my older sister. We'll call her Eliza. We had a cousin, who we'll call Jerry, visiting us from out of country. And as he and my sister are particularly close due to them being closer in age, she took it upon herself to be his tour guide, since he hadn't been to California since he was a small child. Eliza and Jerry are big fans of pop culture, particularly pop music. There was a fairly famous pop singer performing here in Los Angeles, which is a bit of a ways away from where we all live. Eliza was a huge fan, and she actually bought tickets specifically for Jerry and her so they could go during the visit. At first, I was a bit salty that I was not invited, so whatever. Not wanting to miss out on a fun day trip, I decided to invite 2 of my close friends, who we'll call Savannah and Eric, who were something of a couple at the time. I don't have my license, but both of them do. So that way, once Jerry and Eliza got to the show, we could still drive around and do whatever. My sister drove the 5 of us to Los Angeles. She and Jerry in the front, with Savannah, Eric, and me in the back. Despite being a casual fan of the artist they were going to go see, Eliza and Jerry played the artist on repeat the entire time, with traffic over a 3-hour trip. Mind you, this artist only had like 3 albums at the time, and so it got pretty old really quick. My friends and I tend to like softer, more rock-type music, so we can assure that this was more than enough. Anyway, once we got to LA, around noon, we were all hungry in need of the restroom. Being in LA, it's hard to find available clean restrooms to use whenever. I suspect it's due to the constant use of homelessness, and thus many places are not open to public without purchasing something. So, not only was the constant need to find restrooms a bit frustrating, but finding food we could all agree on was also adding to the stress. Jerry had never tried ramen before, since traditional Japanese food isn't easily found where he lives. Anyway, Jerry and Eliza were totally in their own world, like literally getting pumped for the show later that night. Eliza would ignore whatever my friends and I requested to do during our time, and definitely play the "I'm older than you" and been around for longer. We dropped the two off, and the rest of the night was fun, just as it always is when the three of us hang out. We went to Santa Monica, watched the sunset, and walked around a bit. By the time we were starting to get hungry, we checked out Yelp and found a burger place that looked amazing, as well as suited our tight budget. I don't go to LA often, so when we pulled the directions out and got there, I was not aware of which part we were exactly in. We were looking to park, but a group of what appeared to be gang members stood in front of the spot we were going to park. They began approaching the car and putting their hands on the exterior while looking into the window. Eric was driving and said something to the effect of, "You guys fine with parking here?" Not fine with parking there, but Eliza and I told them we needed to pack up and find somewhere else. I've always been extremely cautious, especially in LA, since I've had a few other unsavory experiences, including the time a man followed me and my friend into our car, and we had to shove him out. So there's no way in hell I felt good parking there. We drove a few blocks, starving, and ready to just forget it all. That's when we found a clear spot in a well-populated area. The food was great, and all was well. Aside from the bunches of homeless that I saw around me, pretty common in any part of LA you find, I didn't even realize we had been in the heart of Skid Row. Once we made our way over, though, we discovered that the place we wanted to eat was in the midst of Skid Row. For those who don't know anything about LA, Skid Row is a neighborhood in downtown Los Angeles that extends about roughly 50 blocks. It's mostly home to the homeless. There are also a lot of dealers and ladies of the night that hang around too. We were walking back to our car, and I looked up to one of the taller buildings, right along the block. The sign at the side on the top of the building read, "Hotel Cecil, low weekly rates, 700 rooms." This hotel could be a post in and of itself, but in short, it's an old hotel that briefly was in its prime back in the 1920s and 30s. But as the Depression struck, the hotel and its entire ambiance went down with it. It had been known for housing some of society's unsavory, such as the homeless, and those in the entire drug and sex industry, along with a few infamous guests, such as the Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez, just to name a few. It's supposed to be vacant as of now, but as far as I could see, I'm pretty sure there was ongoing activity within the building and all around it. Squatters, I'm assuming. I don't believe in the paranormal or anything like that, but I can confirm the unanimous thought that place gives off is really sketchy, creepy. Once I realized that's where we were, my friends and I booked it to the car. Thankfully, nothing happened, but naturally, I was on edge a bit after that. We stopped to pick up some pie at a shop that Eric was obsessed with, since it was on our way to the venue Eliza and Jerry were at. We thought we had plenty of time, but by the time we got to eating, Eliza called me and demanded we come over immediately. I knew nothing was wrong, so I did hurry a bit, but we decided to finish our pies before heading off. Eliza kept texting me with impatience, saying things like, "Waiting here is boring. Where are you? We're tired. We want to go now." You know, the typical bossy older sister things. She was kind of a jerk to me the entire day anyway, so I guess I used that to justify my jerkiness back. But then, we had another bump in the road. The pie Savannah tried had peanuts cooked into the crust, and she got so sick. We rushed out of there and tried to stop somewhere for water and antihistamine, since she did not have her EpiPen. She began feeling a tad better, but she was still really sick. Now I'm stressed and worried. Once we got to the venue, Eliza and Jerry took forever to come out. I guess they started waiting to see if they could meet the artist. Once they finally came in, Eric and I shuffled to the back seat. Eliza had the nerve to yell at me for taking so long. We had to stop a few times so Savannah could throw up and rehydrate. On top of that, Eliza and Jerry continued to play the same artist again and again and again. With Savannah sick, Eric as aloof as ever, and me stressing on edge about everything that had happened thus far, I was just ready to bang my head against the window. I know, in the scheme of things, these aren't big deals, but by the time they were all adding up, especially my sick friend and the bad attitude of my sister, it drove me up the wall. So, we dropped Eric and Savannah off first, since their town was on the way before ours. Now it's around 1 a.m. At that point, I was sick and tired of all the music and loud talking. I just wanted it done. I was that level of mad when you're quiet angry. So, once the two left, I left the car and demanded that I drove home the rest of the way. Mostly so I could DJ. Once again, I am up the wall, very on edge. I play music as I drive us home and everything seems fine. It's almost when something happens. Our house is off the major freeway in town, though it's a bit of a lonely, desolate area. To get to our place, you have to pass a hilltop with other houses, make a turnaround to get to our neighborhood. There's a cemented patch of grass between a stretch of concrete, between the hill and the turn that's used as a divider between the oncoming and ongoing traffic. As I'm approaching, coming up to make my turn around the hill, on my left, I see something that's creeped me out and been on my mind ever since. At this point, it's roughly 2 a.m. The area isn't too busy. This late at night, this early in the morning, on the grass divider and along the cement, there are people lined along the thinner cement part of the divider and on the grass patch. A small crowd. There was at least 15, and they were all wearing white. I could see them perfectly with my lights and the brightness of their clothes. And they were moving around, almost doing a jig when I came up. As I was driving next to them, unable to take my eyes off, they started raising their voices, all talking at once. I could hear it through the window and over my music. Then, they all in unison started sprinting toward me, trying to get my attention, and following along as I pulled to the right to make my turn. They literally were following me, talking to us. It was the most bizarre, creepy thing. I can't say for sure, but their outfits were akin to KKK, but different. I'm obviously having a what is going on moment. I didn't have a clue about what I saw, but of course, I knew I did see something. I scream in panic and ask Eliza and Jerry if they saw. Of course they had. But I know what I saw, whatever they were. Some of their faces were covered, and I know I saw a man who had a beard, and they were rushing over, and I got the feeling they wanted me to stop the car. I know people sometimes create diversions or distractions, like that for their own nefarious reasons, to target drivers. I'm not sure what it is they were going to do. The town I live in is small, old, and somewhat rural. We're known as one of the most conservative towns in the US, so I guess it could have been something like the KKK, or due to the way they're dressed, there are also some known observers of the occult. I don't know. Eliza and Jerry got irritated with me. I drove around the block past our own a few times, rather than immediately pulling into our street. I was pretty sure they were not following anymore. I told our mother about this. She believed me, I think to an extent, but I mean, it does sound really absurd. And my sister to this day claims that it never happened. She even refuses to believe or acknowledge I was the one driving. But I know at the very least this happened. Be careful, guys. When you go out of town, especially to a place like Los Angeles, you can expect some weird stuff. But the strangest, and possibly the most dangerous ones, were just a little over a block away from my house, lurking in the dark, waiting for some passing motorist to stop and talk to them. Or maybe something far more evil than just talking. Childhood paranormal experience. Around 1986, a toddler-sized talking doll, whose name I'm still too superstitious to repeat, hit the market. She had blonde, curly ringlets and large blue eyes that moved around right when she talked. The sounds she made came from a cassette player that was built into her back, and her rubber mouth would open and close along with the audio. The first time I saw one of these dolls in person was at a friend's house. For the next year, I would persistently beg my parents for that doll. When I was 8, they surprised me with one for my birthday. Between 1988 and 1989, the doll and I got along well. I began to outgrow the cutesy and babyish cassettes that came with her, so sometimes I would just put random tapes in her back, even music. I would laugh hysterically as her mouth and eyes moved along with everything from classical music to my dad's boring financial tutorials, narrated by a droning male voice. That man's voice emanating from the doll's mouth was totally creepy, but even more hilarious. I inevitably got bored of this, but for at least a year, I had some good times. It was towards the end of my 4th grade school year in 1989, and one night, I was getting ready for bed. This night was marked by a gradual uneasiness, which began out as a barely noticeable, but by the time I was in bed, I began to worry that I may never get sleep. It was odd. I mean, there was nothing in particular that I was anticipating or that was bothering me. No class trips, tests, or anything that might trigger a sleepless night. I wondered if I was coming down with something. I was feeling ever so slightly unwell, and the sensations in my body were causing me a great deal of anxiety. I laid with this discomfort for at least 2 hours, wanting to toss and turn, but felt too emotionally paralyzed to move. For some reason, I wanted to face the wall. In fact, I was afraid to face the open space, and a sense of dread had emerged. I remembered what my mom told me about not being able to sleep. She recommended that I did not force myself to close my eyes, so I left them open. Periodically, my eyelids would close, but then my awareness of them closing would wake me up. Another hour went by. I was used to hearing the occasional whirring of cars, but after laying awake for so long, the traffic noise gradually ceased. The quietness of the room was distracting. Judging by the lack of street noise, I'm guessing that it was 3 or even 4 in the morning. Then, I heard something impossibly bizarre and barely audible. My baby brother's crib was across the room by the window. He was not talking yet, and no more than a couple of words at most. Certainly not counting. But I heard him not just counting, but doing it backwards from 10. Every number was spoken in an exaggerated, drawn-out, sing-song voice that started from a lower tone and eventually made its way to a higher one. I peeked quickly over my shoulder to look at the crib, but it looked like he was asleep. 10, 9, 8, 7. I pulled the covers tightly around my body, tried to convince myself that I didn't hear what I was hearing. After all, the volume of that tiny voice was extremely low. Perhaps the baby was babbling in her sleep, and my brain was trying to make sense of it. Could I have dozed off? Well, that's the thing. I'd been awake the entire night. 5, 4, etc. Then, a faint clicking sound came from the corner beside my brother's crib. There was a small wooden chair in the corner. Each of its legs had a metal wheel which clicked in such a way when the chair was being moved. It was unmistakable. The chair was moving on its own. I didn't dare to turn to look. I was depending on the last ounce of denial that I could possibly muster. The worst thing about this chair, other than its sudden independent movement, was that the permanent residence of this doll, when it was not in use, was there. I knew she was sitting on that chair before I got into bed. Then, it felt as though the air was sucked out of the room, and all I could hear was the audible clicking of the chair's wheels as they inched closer and closer to my bed. I began to call out for my parents, but I was unable to yell loudly enough. The fear was so intense I could barely move. Eventually, I decided that I should just make a run for the door and hope for the best. The problem was that in order to get out of the room, I would have to risk looking at that doll. Finally, able to move a bit, that's when I made the mistake of turning my head too far around, and I saw the doll in her chair inches away from my bed. What's even worse is that her face was contorted in such a way that, as an adult, I can compare to Regan from The Exorcist. But as a 9-year-old, I had no concept of this. The doll's eyes were also looking upward, but slightly to the corner, creating an absolutely horrifying image I'll never forget. That's when I let out a powerful shriek. I did so reflexively, and it was almost like listening to somebody else's scream. When my parents came running in, the doll was back in her corner, and I was never believed. I slept in my parents' bed that night, and they were angry at me. I dreamt that the car was driving in circles around some suburban neighborhood that I'd never seen before. Living alone with the aftermath of this experience was traumatic in and of itself. The following week, I was so paranoid about seeing inanimate objects doing things they weren't supposed to that I jumped to conclusions about certain things. For instance, the shampoo and conditioner that was in the shower one evening felt significantly heavier than they did the day earlier. I was afraid that the substance somehow materialized at will. My mom just insisted that water probably got in it, but it had not. I turned the bottles over. No excess water came out. Perhaps it was my paranoia, but I'm not ruling anything out anymore. Not after what I experienced. It took me several months to feel somewhat normal again, and even to this day, I'm still affected by this incident. The unexplainable happenings. I've always known that unexplained entities exist. I just have. I have never had a significant experience, such as an apparition, and I'm thankful, and I'd rather not, to be honest. But I've experienced minor things here and there. 2 experiences I can recount occurred at my Oma, which is the German word for grandma, and Opa's house here in Hawaii. I've also had quite a few family members share their more terrifying experiences with me over the years, which also happened in said house. But let's start with my own, for my most recent experiences. I am currently a 27-year-old female, ancient, I know, and would often sleep over at Oma's house from 5 to 15 years old, mostly on weekends. I enjoyed being there, as she and I were very close. She would spoil me from when I could first talk, up until she lost her memory to dementia. Yeah, that depressing evil disease that causes everybody you love some major suffering as you slowly forget who you are and your family members are. Anyway, she was always a huge jokester, always laughing, farting, tickling, making sarcastic remarks, and jumping out to scare any and all of her family members. It was a Friday night, and I was 14 years old. I was on the PC they had in their designated computer room, because I couldn't sleep. The room is about the size of a bigger closet, just big enough to comfortably fit a desk. The room is also kind of weird, if you understand what I mean. If you're sitting on the chair facing the PC, the door is behind and to the left of you, so you can't see if somebody comes in unless you turn to the left. Directly across the hallway is the room I would sleep in, and if you were to take the right outside of the room, you would see my grandparents' room at the other end of the hallway. Now, I always had an ominous feeling of being in that house, especially when night would fall, and especially after my grandparents went to bed. I was the only one awake. So there I was, on MSN Messenger, talking with one of my friends. The clock showed something like 1 or 2 a.m. I was beginning to get sleepy, but being a teen, it'd be way too uncool to sleep early on a Friday night. Because I was a bit distracted, I felt completely at ease. No spooky feelings or chill in the air, nor was I the slightest bit paranoid. That is, until I feel somebody blow lightly in my left ear. 2 times, back to back. "Oma," I exclaimed, beginning to laugh and turning to face her. She wasn't there. It was no one. "Oma," I called, while standing up out of the chair, fully expecting her to be hiding in my temporary room. As I peeked in, ready to surprise her, I then began to look down the dark hallway, knowing her room door, which would be open, provided she snuck out to scare me. Closed. The door was closed. She always slept with it closed. She had not been the one to blow in my ear. My grandpa certainly isn't the type to play pranks. He's an old school guy from the Philippines. This is the last thing he would ever do, nor is he fast enough to pull this sort of thing off. I was the only person in this entire house aside from them. If it wasn't either of them, who was it? Has anybody else felt something like this before that doesn't involve touching? My second encounter happened several years before this one. It was a holiday evening, sometime back in the mid-2000s, and all of my oldest children, out of 4 being my mom, and their spouses and their children, were over. I was around 9 years old and filled with energy. My cousin Derek, who was around 7, we were tossing a tennis ball back and forth in the house on the very first floor. Everyone was either in the living room, kitchen, or the front yard. There was a carpeted staircase that ran perpendicular from the living room and straight up to the second floor. From the bottom of the staircase, you could see the most of the living room, and obviously up the stairs. From the top of the staircase, you could see the stairwell down to the bottom, and a very small fraction of the living room. It consisted of about 15 stairs and had its own light bulb, so nobody would have to blindly walk the stairs at night. We decided to move the ball tossing to the stairs. Why not? I was on the very top, and Derek at the bottom. We were bouncing the ball lightly up and down the stairs for about 15 minutes, until our parents told us to go eat dinner. I caught the ball and flicked the light switch for the stairwell to down position to turn the light off, then ran down the stairs to get food. After making our plate, we all sat in the living room. "Can you turn the light off?" my auntie asks me, being the last one to use the light in the stairwell. Puzzled, I looked up at the now illuminated bulb. I set my plate on the table, charged up the stairs, and flicked the switch down again, ran back down the stairs. A few minutes go by, and we're shoveling our faces. "I thought Auntie Tammy asked you to turn the light off," my mom questions me. My heart sank as I looked up and I see the stairlight on once again. "I turned it off," I said confidently. The switch was up, so I made sure to turn it down and saw the light shut off visibly while I was up there. My mom just looked at me unconvinced. "I don't think so," she says. "No, I saw her turn it off," my auntie explains. I saw it turn back on too when she came downstairs after a few seconds, but I didn't want to say anything. My grandparents have passed away for some years now, and the house has been sold. A decision that was agreed upon by their very children. Not a single good dream. They always involve an evil, honest to God. They've never been good. Not a single good dream. Anyway, my entire family knows the new owners of the house, and they are contacted every so often. Apparently, they've had quite a few unexplainable occurrences of their own since moving in. Dark entities in the house. I'm curious to know if anybody has any idea of what all of this means. Is it evil? Are these entities good or bad? Or am I just paranoid? Do my dreams carry any sort of truth to them? Please, I would love to know. A warning from the grave. Many years ago, when I was young and fit, I was out exercising before dawn. Our local cemetery was high on a hill, and I would walk up said hill, then jog all around the concrete and gravel roads that wound in and around the graves. I had done this many prior mornings, and I was not afraid of being in the graveyard pre-daylight. I had family and friends there, buried there, of course. It was isolated. I felt safe. One of the individuals interred there was a little girl named Kay. Kay was only 12 and starting junior high school when an impatient idiot behind the wheel of a car killed her. On my frequent runs past Kay's well-kept grave, I often greeted her, wished her well, and expressed my sorrow regarding her short, sweet life. On this particular morning of which I write, I jogged past her grave and called out a greeting. In my head, she spoke urgently to me. It's not safe up here this morning. I jogged on, a bit startled. Of course, I glanced about, but all was normal. A few minutes later, Kay spoke again. There's a man up here. This time I stopped. Suddenly, the dark hilltop seemed fraught with danger. My blood ran cold, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up, were no longer cliches. Still, I saw nothing. No man, no movement. But by now, every nerve in my body was screaming for me to get out of there now. I turned and ran. It was no longer a casual morning jog. It was a sprint for my life. I ran past Kay's grave and back down the steep hill, caring not that my quadriceps complained. As I fled, I listened for any pursuers, but I heard none. But that did not lessen the overwhelming sense of peril that kept me running hard even after I exited the steep part of my route. The rest of that day, and even the remainder of the week, I listened for news of an escaped convict, a murderous madman, or anything that would explain Kay's urgent warning. There was none. I had no doubt then, nor do I many years later, that I was in peril that morning. From whom, I do not know. But 15 years have passed, and I could still recall with crystal clarity those two sentences from a poor child put much too early in her grave. Thank you. Ghost Dog. When I was 11, we lived in the middle of nowhere, Minnesota. The house we lived on was top of a giant hill with a really steep driveway. In the winter, we would sled down it, which stopped at the edge of the dirt road and ran past our place. We had a ridgeback mixed dog named Sammy that liked to chase us as we sled down the hill. Unfortunately, he also liked to chase cars. You could see where this is going. My sister sat up on top of the hill, watching me sled down with Sammy chasing behind. When I stopped at the bottom, I noticed this maroon van coming towards me. For some reason, I was frozen in place. Sammy saw it coming and instantly stood at the side of the road in front of me, barking at the car. My sister was yelling at me to run up the hill so Sammy would chase me instead, but I was frozen. It all happened within seconds. The van refusing to brake or slow down. They just plowed right over him, right in front of me. Literally 10 feet or less in front of me. They must have seen him. They must have seen me. They didn't stop. They didn't care. Just kept driving. A chunk of their bumper broke off, for Pete's sakes. I heard my sister screaming and crying at the top of the hill as we see Sammy lying there, motionless. So, me being the oldest, I thought I'd better get Mom. My sister being paralyzed with grief. So, I run all the way up the hill and got our parents. My mother picked him up, ran him to their car, immediately to the vet. Later that night when she got back, he was dead. They were going to have to bury him the next day. For some reason, when my mom thought we'd need some kind of closure, she put his body wrapped in a blanket in the porch by the back door. His head was exposed, and his eyes were still open. It was terrifying. That night, I had a dream that Sammy ran up the stairs and into my bedroom. In my sleep, my right hand was hanging over the bed, and in the dream, he came and licked it. I woke up screaming in terror. It was the most realistic dream I had ever experienced. When my mom came in my room and asked what happened, her response was, he was just coming to say goodbye. Charlie, the ghost in my room. As a child, I frequently watched horror films and ghost hunting shows. I was always fascinated by the paranormal. However, I never imagined that I would have my own real-life ghost story that came together in the form of multiple experiences and a dream to connect all the dots. Prior to my story, I had multiple paranormal experiences that left me as a firm believer, long before I was ever 14. However, the story I will tell you now happened between October and November of 2014. I had just begun my freshman year of high school at a private school here in Northern California. It all started on a random October night when I was jolted awake for no apparent reason at 2 a.m. This was unusual for me, as I never ever wake up in the middle of the night, and if I do, it's to grab a sip of water and then drift off into sleep within minutes. However, this time was weird. I awoke to a wall of silence that was so great I could practically hear static in the air. You know when you are sitting in a room with someone and you don't know too well in awkward silence? You could see them gearing up to speak. Well, that is what it felt like in my room. But obviously, I couldn't see anybody else there, and the feeling of awkwardness was replaced by fear. Well, since this had never happened to me before, I tried to ignore this odd feeling, and I turned over trying to force myself back to sleep. Just as I began to feel myself relax, I heard a voice from the corner of my room say very clearly, "Hello." Within seconds, I was running up and down the hall, screaming for my parents, who frantically woke up, searched my entire room, looking for the person I was so convinced was in my room. Obviously, they didn't find anyone, but I was shaken and slept in my sister's room for about 2 weeks after. After a while, I had convinced myself that this was some random isolated incident. But what I found the most odd was that the voice didn't have a gender. It was just a voice, nothing more than that. This helped me to convince myself that perhaps it was not a voice at all. Instead, something I'd imagined or a random noise that I had interpreted as a voice. So, after a while, I let it go, began to sleep in my own room again. Now, at this point, it was early November, and I had been sleeping in my room again without incident for an entire week. That is, until it happened again. It was like clockwork, man, where I abruptly awoke at 1:56 a.m. for no reason, and the same feeling of silence and static filled the air. However, as scared as I was, I remained in my bed and reassured myself that what happened last time was all just in my head. However, I was proved wrong when in the same corner of my room, I heard the exact same laugh. Except it wasn't the sound of someone laughing. It was someone saying the words, aha, ha, ha. Now, I don't know about you, but I can't think of any wind, my dogs, or really anything that could make this noise, or anything that could speak. Let me tell you, I was out of my room screaming for my parents within seconds. They were, of course, concerned that I believed somebody was again in my room, but they were mostly irritated I had disrupted their sleep because of what they believed to be my imagination. So, at this point, I was convinced that my room that I had slept in without incident for 8 years now was haunted. And believe me, I didn't know how to explain it either. I began to beg my parents to do research on our home and see if there was any way it could possibly be haunted. However, given that our house was built in 2008, we're the only people to ever live in it. They would just roll their eyes and told me there was no way. However, I will never forget Thanksgiving morning when it all came together. I awoke that morning after having a dream so vivid and true. It feels as if I'm reliving it, simply by typing it here. In my dream, I am at the end of the hallway, running frantically towards my closed bedroom door at the end of the hallway. Except, my house is in flames all around me, and as fast as I can run, it seems I can never reach my bedroom door. Finally, I reach my door, but laying on the ground is a piece of paper that I lean down and pick up. Written on it, in messy handwriting, it says, "No one goes in insert room's name anymore because of Charlie Bennett." Suddenly, my door opens and there stands a tall man in his 60s, wrinkled, skinny, with a long gray beard, black boots, and a flannel shirt. When I see him, I can only assume that this is Charlie Bennett, the man who was haunting my room. Now, when I awoke that Thanksgiving morning, I distinctly remember telling my dad about my dream casually, not expecting much of a reaction. Except, he looks at me shocked, as if I had slapped him in the face, and he says, "You did not dream that." That's really weird. It turns out, my parents had begun asking the neighbors who had lived in the neighborhood long before our house was ever built about our property, and if anything had ever occurred there. They found out that before our house was ever built, there was this old abandoned home that homeless people had been squatting in. However, one night, it caught on fire, and one of the homeless men inside died. Shortly after, they cleared the lot, and our home was freshly constructed just years after. It turns out, my parents believed me the whole time. They just chose not to tell me because they didn't want to give any truth to what I was experiencing. But my dad's face and reaction was more than enough for me to know how freaked out they were. I have never seen him react in such a way in my life, and I don't think I will ever see him that shocked ever again. Now, it's been nearly 7 years later, and what is so odd is that those 2 months seem to be a random and isolated few instances. I have no idea why it happened, and especially why Charlie waited years after we moved in. But I have had no more visits since. I have had random things happen here and there, such as finding the sink or stove turned on by itself, or my iPad moving into a different spot than I had left it. But other than that, I wouldn't even consider my house to be haunted. It is almost as if Charlie wanted somebody to know his story, and now that I knew, he was satisfied and could leave. If you or someone you know has a story they would like me to read or share with me, I'd be happy to do so. Please submit them to stories@whatlurksbeneath.com. Thank you.